bunch of pensioners. Anyways, it's very nice to be here, and thank you all for coming. I guess there's lots and lots of people out there. Yeah, there is. Wow, it's very nice to be here. Being down south here in Texas and Arizona, it's been really good. Very welcoming crowds, very friendly, nice. Hot though, God, it's hot. Canadian, you know. If the water is liquid, we're not comfortable. All right, so I'm going to talk to you, I think, about 2 rules tonight. Maybe we'll get to more, but I want to concentrate on 2. I'm going to concentrate, first of all, on Rule 10. And Rule 10 is be precise in your speech. And I want to use that rule to develop, I guess, what do you say, as the centerpiece of a meditation on how we perceive the world. Because we don't perceive the world the way we think we perceive the world. I've studied perception for a long time from a biological perspective. And if you study phenomena from a biological perspective and you have any sense, you also study them from a philosophical perspective. I mean, the philosophical perspective is what enables you to develop the ideas that you test if you're a scientist. And so, and I've learned all sorts of things about the way that we perceive the world that I think are really useful. They're really useful to know. And so I'm going to tell you a bunch of those things tonight because I think it'll help you understand, well, what you're like and why you're like that. It's a terrible thing to understand, of course. But I want to aim at something else too. I want to craft the discussion so that we can deeply investigate the answer to the question, what should you aim at? Because you have to aim at something. We're aiming creatures, and that's like rule number 1 of perception. So I'm going to tell you the story first about a very famous psychology experiment, which you can see online. It was an experiment done by a Harvard psychologist who was interested in perception. He was interested in something called change blindness. And here's how the experiment went. I'm sure many of you have seen it. He videotaped a group of 6 people, 3 dressed in black and 3 dressed in white. He videotaped them in front of an elevator, which wasn't really relevant, but I'm just setting this stage for you. And the team dressed in black had a basketball, and the team dressed in white had a basketball, and they were playing a game, and the game was pass the basketball. Not a very sophisticated game. And the black team would pass the basketball to their teammates dressed in black, and the white team would pass the basketball to their teammates dressed in white, and they would mill around in front of the elevator. And they filled the whole frame. They weren't distant. They weren't tiny little people, a half a football field away. They filled the whole frame, so you could see their facial features and everything. And so your job, you'd come into Dan Simon's lab, because the scientist's name was Dan Simon. You'd come into Dan Simon's lab, and he'd sit you down, and you'd sit down, and you'd listen to him, because that's what you do in a psychology lab, and that's worth thinking about too. Just like when you come into the theater, you point forward and you watch the stage. You do what the room tells you. You do what the experimenter tells you. That's part of establishing your aim. He said to his experiment participants, watch the white team. They're going to throw a basketball back and forth. It's going to take about 3 minutes. All you have to do is count the number of times they throw the basketball. And so you think, I can do that. And you watch. And you're watching the basketball. You're counting very carefully. You're concentrating on the task at hand because you've been instructed to do that. And the videotape runs to the end. And Dan says, how many times did the white team pass the basketball? And you say 16. And Dan says, you're absolutely right. And you think, well, you're pretty damn smart. You went into a psychology lab and you participated in the experiment, you counted the basketballs properly, it's like you're a credible human being. You know, point attained. And then Dan says, well, did you see anything out of the ordinary? And you say, well, no, what do you mean? He said, well, did you see the gorilla? And you think, what do you mean? Did I see? Of course, what gorilla? Like, if there was a gorilla, what do you mean, what gorilla? I didn't see any damn gorilla. And so Dan rewinds the tape and he says, look, don't count the damn basketball system. He didn't say that. He said, don't count the basketball system. Don't count the basketball this time, just watch the film. So you watch it, and sure enough, like a minute into the film, this guy comes out. It's not a real gorilla, but it's close enough. He's like 6'4". He's got a gorilla suit on. It's the full thing. And he stands right in the middle of the video and pounds his chest for like 5 seconds and then saunters off. And about 50% of the people who saw the video, 60% of the people, didn't see the gorilla. You think, no, I'd see the gorilla. It's like, no, you wouldn't. Not necessarily. I had a graduate student I showed that video to, and then I showed it to him a year later. He missed the damn gorilla the second time. Really, that really happened. And you think, no, there's no way I'm that blind. It's like, yes, you are. You're so blind, you cannot bloody well imagine it. It's an absolute miracle that you just don't walk face first into walls all the time. Actually, you do. That's why life hurts, because you don't see very well, and you do walk face first into things all the time. Maybe not literal walls, but certainly metaphorical ones, and that's often because you don't see what's in front of you, and it's because you're looking at the wrong thing. And so what was so cool about that experiment, so insanely cool, psychologists up to that point thought that, well, we thought a lot of things, and a lot of, not just psychologists thought it too. We thought it was easy to see the world. That was kind of disproved back in the early 60s when people were trying to build machines that could operate in the world like people do, trying to solve the problem of machine perception. You know, we just thought, well, look, there's an object, it's right there, it's pretty self-evident, you just see it. Well, you know how easy it is. All you have to do to see that object is look at it. There it is. It's not a problem. There's nothing magical about it. It's like, yeah, you try to build a machine that does that. You find out that perceiving separable objects is so difficult that it actually looks impossible. It isn't obvious at all how we do it, not in the least. And that's why it's so difficult to build machines. That's why we don't have ambulatory robots bussing tables, for example. It's very hard to see the world. And then psychologists, well, even when they figured out that it was hard to see the world, they still thought that you would perceive abnormalities in the world, that you would perceive anomalies. So if something strange happened, you'd focus your attention on it right away. It turns out that's not true. You know, you can watch a video of 6 people throwing a basketball back and forth, 2 teams of 3, and a gorilla can come out right in the middle of that, and you won't notice it. It's like, well, what's going on there? Why won't you notice that? Why didn't you see that? And one of the answers is because you were looking at something else. And so then the question arises, it's like, what are you missing when you're looking at what you think is important? Because you come into the lab, and the psychologist says, well, the important thing to do here is to count the basketballs, and you just fall into that because, well, you're there to participate, you're a cooperative person and all that, but you swallow the story immediately. And what's so interesting about the fact that you swallow the story is that as soon as you swallow the story, you listen to the experimenter, you play out the game, then you immediately adopt a particular kind of perception. Not thought, hey? It's below thought. It's actually what you see. You adopt a particular sort of perception, and then the world manifests itself to you in one way and not another. And it isn't necessarily the way that you would think. And it begs this question. It's like, what are you missing when you're aiming at what you're aiming at? And the answer to that is, you might be missing almost everything. That's what it looks like. So Simon did another experiment. This was even a more amazing experiment. So he did this in Harvard Yard. And there's lots of tourists in Harvard Yard. It's a place where people go. It's a very cool place, actually. And there's undergraduates milling all around in Harvard Yard with the tourists because it's a university. And so what Simon did was he was wondering, well, just how blind people are. how blind are people? They won't see a gorilla when it's right in front of them. That's pretty blind. Let's try another trick. So what he did was he sent out undergraduates to ask tourists for directions with a map. So imagine tourist is standing here, undergraduate is standing here. Undergraduate has a map, asks tourists where things are in the yard. Okay, so person standing here, person standing here. Now some workmen come by, 2 of them, and they're carrying a door like this. And here's the door, and they rudely walk right between the tourist and the undergraduate, walk right between them. And then as the undergraduate is blocked from the tourist's view, the undergraduate grabs the door, keeps on walking, and one of the people that was holding the door grabs the map and starts talking to the tourist. So Dan figured out how to swap the person. And about 60% of the people who were giving directions to the undergraduate didn't notice that they were talking to a different person. It's like, and so what does that imply? It implies that, like, you're out there in the world talking to people, and they're just shifting into different people right in front of you, and you don't even notice. And then he did it in a convenience store. And so he would have people come in and interact with the convenience store owner, and the convenience store owner would duck down behind the counter to grab something, and then a different person would pop up. And again, more than half of the people didn't notice that it was a different person. That was even if they were wearing different colored clothing. And you think, well, what does this mean? What does this mean? And it means that you don't see any more of the world than you need to see in order to get what you're aiming at. That's what it means. It really, really, literally means that. You actually don't see it. It's not that you don't remember it. It's not that you don't think about it. It's that you're physically incapable of seeing it. And this experiment has been replicated in many, many ways. If I took you out of the room, one by one, out of the room that you're sitting in, and I said, well, what color was the floor? Of course, you can't tell right now because it's dark, but it wasn't dark when you came in here. You wouldn't remember what color the floor is. And the reason for that is you actually don't care. What do you care about with regards to a floor? Well, mostly you care that it doesn't move, right? You don't want the floor to move. That's a bad thing. And so, as long as it doesn't move, you don't have to perceive it. And that's sort of the rule. And now, why don't you want the floor to move? Well, what does it signify if the floor moves? Well, it probably signifies that maybe there's an earthquake, and that's a bad thing. That's a seriously bad thing. I was in a hotel once, and I was looking at this. It was at a scientific convention. I was looking at this. It's kind of like an advertisement for a scientific paper. They're called posters, and they're they're advertisements for scientific papers, and you put yours up on this, like, wall board, room divider, basically. You pin it up, and people come by and they ask you questions about your experiment, and all of a sudden I just about fell over. I was knocked off balance, and the reason I was knocked off balance was because the wall beside me moved. It was a big hotel, and the wall moved. You do not expect that. You do not expect that. It moved quite a bit. Well, it turned out that they had movable walls. It's like, who knew, right? But it was one of these dividable rooms, and so, but it took me off guard so badly that it just about knocked me over. But normally I was orienting myself in the room. Normally I wouldn't even pay attention. You don't pay attention to anything that doesn't get in your way. Now that's an interesting thing. That's an interesting thing, because you see, the question is, what do you see when you look at the world? Okay. Now, we're going to take this apart, because it's unbelievably important, this. So, when you're watching the basketballs, you use the central point of your vision to process the visual field. Now, you can kind of detect this yourself. Like if I look at this gentleman in the front row, and I look right at his eyes, then I can see his eyes and I can see his face in quite high resolution. But if I look at him and I pay attention to the people to his side without looking at them, what I notice is that the farther out of the center of my field of vision those people become, the less I can really see them. Like, I'm pointing at a woman, I think, here. I can't tell because I'm looking at the guy right in front of me. I think she's dressed in red, but I can't see. And you there, I know you're a human being, but I can't see your face. And you people over there are basically just blurs. And I know that you're there, and of course, when I point, I want to look at you, because then I can see you, but looking at you, you guys are low resolution. You're like Simpsons characters over there, except you're in black and white, and I can't even tell that. And so, just so you know, in the periphery of your vision, things are black and white. You can't tell that, but that's the case. And mostly, over in the periphery, you don't see things unless they move. You know how in Jurassic Park, the dinosaur didn't see anything unless it moved? Well, that's what your vision is like in the periphery. Process different parts of your visual field. So anyways, when you're looking at the basketball, you think, okay, what is it exactly? What exactly is going on when you're looking at that basketball in that experiment? Well, first of all, you're playing a role, because the role is experimental subject. And it's a little drama. And the drama involves the experimenter too. And the experimenter is basically the boss. Or you treat him like, or her, like a higher status primate. Your job is to listen to them and to take instructions. And that's essentially to adopt the story or the role that they tell you to play. And you'll do that because, well, you volunteered for the experiment. You're already in for the experience, just exactly as I said, just as all of you in some sense volunteered to come here, and you do what the room tells you to do. The room is set up so that all the seats face this way, and so you come in here and you obey the room, you seat this way, and there's a focal point, and the focal point is the stage, and the room implies that what's important is going to take place on the stage, and you're here for that experience, so you focus on me at the moment, and hopefully the deal is that I tell you things that are interesting, because that's what the room is set up to allow to happen. And so all of that shapes your perceptions in a very, very direct way. And when you go into this lab, and Dan tells you to sit down and count the basketballs, you're experimental subject, you're a civilized human being, you're obedient person, you're good sport, he's authority figure. The context of the university is set up to sort of hammer that home. You're not going to tell him to go to hell when he asks you to watch the basketball, unless you're unbelievably antisocial. You're not going to do that. So it's a drama that you're undertaking. And he offers you a value system, and the value system is something like, if you're a good person, you follow instructions. When the system is set up so that following instructions is the civilized thing to do, and to act out that civility, you sit in that chair, and I give you a set of stage instructions about how you should act, and then you act them out. And you agree to do that, and then that establishes your perceptual set, and that determines what's important in the world, and that determines what manifests itself in the world. And so then you count the basketballs, even though why the hell are you counting basketballs? There's no particular reason, except you want to do a good job, and because of that, you miss what's vital. So that's the extended version of the narrative. So now, if the gorilla would have jumped up and swiped the ball while you were counting it, you would have seen it. If things get in your way, that you see them. So then, let's figure out what you see. So, when I look at someone, again, person in the front row, I generally look at their face, and we generally look at other people's faces when we talk to them, and we're very good at facial recognition, by the way. We have specialized brain areas for recognizing faces, and faces broadcast emotion and intent. And like your face is like a video screen upon which emotions play. And you want to pay attention to someone's emotions and motivational states, and you can see them broadcast them on their face, because then you know what they're up to. And you want to know what they're up to because God only knows what they're up to. And you want to make sure that what they're up to is something that you would want them to be up to when you're around. And so you're watching their face, and what you really watch is their eyes. And here's something really cool about human eyes. So, you know, we have whites around our irises, right? And the whites are white, hence their name, the whites of the eyes. But like lots of the animals that we're closely related to don't have whites like that. So gorillas don't, for example, but human beings really do. Like our irises really stand out against the white background. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is what we really want to see when we look at someone else is, what the hell are they pointing their eyes at? And so there's a famous social psychology experiment, which is really a comical one, where someone stands on the corner of the street and just looks up like this. And if you can do this, you can be the scientist, just go out on the street and go on the corner and just look up. And soon someone will come by and they'll look at you, and you won't look at them, eh? That's part of the trick. You won't look at them, and then they'll think, well, I'm pretty important, and that person isn't looking at me, and so what that means is that whatever they're looking at must be important, more important than me, and that must mean it's pretty important, so I better look too. So then someone will join you and look up as well, and they're trying to figure out what you're looking at, but then of course there's two of you looking up there, and that's kind of abnormal behavior on the street, and so then the third person comes along and, well, there's two people standing on the street looking, so you better look, and so then there's three people, and soon you can get a crowd of people looking up, which is actually a good thing to do in a metaphysical sense, is to get a crowd of people. Yeah. So that's what we're doing tonight. We're getting a whole crowd of people to look up. That's really what we're doing tonight. But anyways, the reason that you look at people's eyes is because you want to see what they're looking at. Because if you can see what they're looking at, then you know what they think is important. Because they're looking at what they think is important. Because why else would you look at something if you didn't think it was important? So that's the thing. You look at things that you think are important. So that's very, very interesting. Now, and so the biological upshot of that is that it's so important for human beings to see where other human beings are pointing their eyes that all of our ancestors that didn't have sharply defined irises against a white background either got killed or didn't reproduce. Like, it's seriously important, and so eye contact is unbelievably important, and our visual systems are specialized so that we can detect tiny, tiny deviations in someone else's glance. Like, you can know from across the room when someone is looking at you. You look at them, you catch each other's eyes, and you know that there's interest. That's what eye contact signifies. And you know, there have been fMRI studies. So fMRI is a technology that allows you to scan the brain as it's operating. If you show men, this has mostly been done with men, but not only. If you show men, imagine you show men a picture of the same woman. Okay, in one picture, the woman is looking off to the left or to the right, doesn't matter. And in the other picture, she's looking directly out, so she's making eye contact, at least in principle, with the man. If the woman, this is generally an attractive woman in these experiments, if the woman is making eye contact with the man, then the gaze will activate part of his brain that's associated with moving towards things. Right, and so that's why eye contact is a pickup maneuver in a bar. So, because if you latch onto someone, you know, the timing has to be right, but if you latch onto someone visually, then that can be interpreted as interest, and that can be interpreted as an invitation. Well, everyone knows that. Maybe sometimes it's not an invitation. Maybe you're just thinking, that guy has the ugliest tie I've ever seen in my life. Right, and then of course he comes over and talks to you, and that's just not good at all. Because you don't want to talk to someone who has the ugliest tie that you've ever seen. So, but in any case, it's an invitation, and you can see the strange manifestations of that in all sorts of places you wouldn't necessarily expect it. So, for example, one of the things that has always fascinated me, well, that's not true. Fascinates me from time to time, not always. I go into a drugstore, and you see all the magazines arrayed there. And what's the most common picture on the cover of a magazine? It's an attractive woman. It's almost always. It doesn't matter if it's a woman's magazine or a man's magazine. And she's looking directly at you. And the reason for that is that if a magazine has that image on the cover, then people will go over to it, approach it, which is what you want if you're a magazine, right? You want people to approach you. Because then they pick you up and they buy you. And so magazines evolve in some sense to have the maximally attractive figure on the cover, because all the magazines that don't have that die. And so that's why magazines end up that way. And so the part of the brain that is activated by that direct eye gaze is called the nucleus accumbens. And it's a brain area that is integrally involved in the neurochemicals. It's part of the material substrate of the neurochemical system that uses the neurochemical dopamine. And dopamine mediates approach behavior, but also, importantly, dopamine is also the chemical whose release is facilitated by drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine, which are very, very addictive. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that those sorts of addictive drugs make you feel like you're approaching worthwhile things. That's why they're so addictive. So if your life is meaningless and you take cocaine, then it feels like you're imbued with a sense of purpose. And that can be addictive. And in fact, it's the definition of addictive in some sense. And so for a neurochemical substance to be addictive, it has to give you the sense that you're pursuing something of value. And so then if you show people stimuli, let's say phenomena, that make them want to approach, then you activate that part of the brain. And so now, if I'm watching someone and I can see what they're looking at, and then I can look at it too, then I know what they think is important. And if I can infer what they think is important, then I can embody who they are in my body. And that's how I understand them. So if I can see what you think is important, because you're looking at it, and I can look at it, then I can adopt that frame of reference, and then I can read off my body what you're feeling, and that's how I feel what you feel. That's how we understand each other. So, and you know this because, look, you go to a movie, let's say, what are you doing in a movie? Well, you're watching the hero or the villain, it doesn't matter, you're watching a character, and you see what the character's up to. That's the plot, essentially. You see what the character's up to, and then you adopt that frame of reference, and you sit there, even though you're sitting there, and all of what's happening in that frame of reference is playing out in your body, in your emotions and your motivations. And it's all happening inside you like a simulation. And so you get to live vicariously as a consequence of adopting the frame of reference of the person that's in the fictional landscape. And that's why you like fiction, because you can go and watch a fictional representation, or you can read a novel, it doesn't matter, wherever you can find a story, and then you can pick up the reference frame of the character in the story, and then you can have the story. You can sit there and learn everything there is to learn about that story just by being passive. And so smart, because if the hero does something stupid and ends up dead, then you can think, well, if you adopt that frame of reference, then you do something stupid and you end up dead. And then if you're smart, you don't do it because you'll end up dead. And why bother with that? Because you don't have to. And so it's like thinking, right? Because here's a way of thinking about thinking. Alfred North Whitehead said, we think so that our thoughts can die instead of us. Which is, it's so smart. It's like when animals try to adapt to the world, the way they do it, because they can't really think, not like we can. What an animal does to adapt to the world is make a whole bunch more animals. That's reproduction, right? So if a mosquito wants to adapt to the world, it has like 10,000 mosquito offspring, and they all differ a little bit, randomly. That's random variation. And most of them aren't successful, they just die. But it doesn't matter, because if you're a mosquito, you only need to produce one mosquito in your lifetime to keep the whole mosquito thing going, and if that costs you 9,999 dead mosquitoes, it doesn't matter, and it's better for the rest of us too. So for a mosquito's idea of an idea is to have a bunch of mosquitoes, but your idea of an idea is to have a bunch of avatars of you, and to lay them out in a fictional world, and to let all the ones that don't do very well die, and then to imitate the ones that survive. And that's part of the reason that we like stories so much, because stories are part of the way we think. They're the way that we produce artificial variants of ourselves in a hypothetical space so that the Darwinian process can occur in abstraction before we embody it. So it's super important, and that's part of the reason that we really, really, really like stories. Because stories are how we live and die without having to live and die. So that's without having to take the risks of real life and death. We can choose what we're going to embody. And we're doing that all the time, and we're sizing up other people. We're seeing what they're looking at, to see what their frames of reference are, to see if we should adopt them for our own, so we want to know what they're up to. And
we see that people we admire and maybe we adopt their frame of reference because that's pushing them ahead in the world properly, and we see people we have contempt for and we move away from their frame of reference because that's not a good way to act out in the world. And then we tell stories to each other all the time trying to figure out what frames of reference we should adopt and which ones we should move away from, and that's how we advance forward. It's very, very sophisticated. So, okay, so back to how you frame the world. So let's say, this will tell you about your emotions, because it's good to know about your emotions and what they are. So let's say I'm over here and I want to walk. I decide that I would rather I'm like the chicken who's going to cross the road. I'm deciding that it's better on the other side of the road. Because that's why the chicken crossed the road, in case you're wondering. Because everyone wonders that, right? Why did the chicken cross the road? It's because the chicken thinks it's better on the other side of the road, because otherwise why would he bother? Obviously. It's a grass is greener on the other side of the fence thing. So it's a stupid riddle, so you can just stop telling it now. All right, so let's say I decide I'm going to walk to the other side of the stage. So now this reality has transformed itself into a stage for me to undertake that action. And so now I'm looking ahead. You're all blurry, like I said, like black and white Simpsons characters. I know you're there, but I can ignore you, because unless one of you comes up and gets in my way, then I don't have to pay attention to the fact that you exist in order to do the thing I'm going to do next. And so I don't, and I literally don't see you. You're gone. Just like the people outside, the people out there in the city, they exist, but I can't see them because they're not here in the way. And so then I look across here and I think, I evaluate the landscape. And I mean that technically. As soon as I make a goal, the landscape changes into a place of value. And what are the values? Well, the values, first of all, are what's irrelevant. And I want everything to be irrelevant, because the world's really, really complicated. It's unbelievably complicated. And if I'm going to have to deal with the whole world, then there's no damn way I'm going to be able to walk across the stage. It's just, I'm going to be racked with doubt. Like, is that the most important thing I should do next? Like, it's just too complicated. So I just ignore it. And so that's mostly what you do when you look at the world, is you just ignore everything. You just ignore absolutely everything, except this tiny fraction of the world that you need to pay attention to in order to get to where you're going. And so that's another thing. You don't really see the world. You don't see the world as a material place. You do in a limited sense, but not really. What you see when you look at the world is a map of how to get from place A to place B. And place B is better than place A because, point A, let's say, point B is better than point A because, well, if it isn't, why would you want to get there? So not only do you see the point you're going to, point B, you contrast that with point A, and you make the presupposition that what you're aiming at is better than what you have. In fact, it's actually the definition of better in some sense, right? Better is what you're aiming at, because, well, unless there's something going seriously wrong with you, maybe you're aiming down. Sometimes that happens, but we're not going to talk about that at the moment. Under normal circumstances, the mere fact that you're intending to do something means that you value it. And so it's a definition of value. So anyways, I'm deciding that I want to get to the other side of the stage. And so now I look at the stage, and this is all irrelevant, and this is all irrelevant, and the floor is kind of gray, and that doesn't matter. It could be just replaced with whatever color, whatever resolution. It's irrelevant as long as it doesn't move. And I'm really irritated by that little chair, little stool in the middle, because it's in my way. And things that are in your way make you feel negative emotion. So obstacles make you feel negative emotion. And clear pathways, they make you feel positive emotion. And that's part of the mapping function. And so one of the things that I've become known for, let's say, is this cliche that you should clean your room. But it's not a cliche. And here's why. You think that your room is just a room. But it's not. Your room there is the room, the independent material room. But that's not the relevant room. The relevant room is the room that you inhabit that's part of your conceptual system and your value system. And if you spend 2 hours a day in a room, in a given room, then that room isn't a room. That room is you for 2 hours a day. It's an extension of you. And if the room is a hellhole, a chaotic catastrophe, then, well, that's you. That's not helpful. And so you think, well, you have a room, it's maybe not a very big one, maybe it's not very fancy, but there it is right in front of you, and you can sort it out, you can set it up, you can make it function as part of what you value, which is what it means to clean it up. It's like, what are you doing in that room? It's a place to wake up. It's a place to go to sleep. It's a place to get ready for the day. What are you going to do during the day? Are you going to get dressed? Well, what are you going to wear? And why are you going to wear it? And how are you going to take care of it? And it's a costume for you, a dramatic costume to go out into the world in and to manifest your role. You want to get up and have to sort through a horrible heap of disorder before you can do whatever useless thing you're planning to inflict on the world? Well, that's a hell of a way to start your day. It's like it's not obvious that you're aiming up. It's not right that it's not that you've got your world construed properly. And it's like, what sort of person do you want to be? Exactly. Well, and maybe you set the room up as the stage on which the person that you want to be can enter the world. That is what you do, if you have any sense. And so to clean up your room is all that. It's to set the stage for the person that you want to be. It's to set the stage for the value structure that you're going to bring into being. And that's going to determine how the world manifests itself to you. That's the thing. Your value structure determines how the world manifests itself to you. And that's actually the case. It's not just metaphorical. Now, there's limits to that. You can value going across the street and step out carelessly and get wiped out by a semi-trailer, and, there's a certain arbitrariness to the world, and the mere fact that you're laying a value structure on it doesn't transform its nature entirely, but it transforms its nature a lot more than you think. So anyways, we go back to my desire to walk across the stage. And so I'm not happy that that obstacle is in my way. And so you can imagine that this might be my bedroom, and it's just littered with mess. And so when I look at that, all I see is a maze of confusion impeding me in the smallest of tasks. And that will make my heart sink. It will make me anxious and disgusted and angry and unmotivated. Especially if it's something that I've created around myself. It's not helpful. So that even the smallest steps that I want to take forward are complicated by unnecessary obstacles. You got to even ask yourself. I had a client once. It was so interesting. He had this dream. He had a new child. He was 30-something. He'd never grown up. And he knew it. And he had this child. And he thought, geez, I better get my act together because, before it was just me, but now I've got this baby. And probably I shouldn't be an immature moron anymore because we're probably not going to be good for the baby. And so then he had this dream that a lightning bolt came into his bedroom, his child's bedroom. It was like a ball lightning. It was bouncing all over the room. And so he told me the dream, and I said, well, you just had this baby, and a baby is potential, like is absolute potential, and for good and for evil, for the whole span of human ability. And now you have this responsibility, and that's what the dream is showing. This incredibly charged thing has entered your life, and it can bounce around and do all sorts of damage. You better straighten yourself up so that you can handle this properly. And so we decided that he would start by cleaning his room, which was a mess, a complete mess. It's like he's 30-something. He can't even clean his room. It's like, how pathetic is that? What is it, inability? You don't know how to do it? Well, that's pathetic. And if it isn't inability, it's like, well, you're not willing to. Well, that's pathetic too. So either way, it's pathetic. And so, or maybe you're too bitter about the structure of reality to clean your room, and that's like your protest. I'll show God and reality what I think. I'll just leave this room. I'll make this room a catastrophe. And that'll be my protest. It's like, hypothesis as far as that was concerned. Vacuum. And so he came back a week later. He said, I tried to vacuum my room, but you know what happened? He said, I put the vacuum in the doorway of my bedroom. So imagine it was one of those push vacuums, So the head of it was laying against one side of the door jamb, and then the handle was leaning against the other. And then he said, and for a whole week, I walked over that vacuum to get into my room. And I thought, that's a microcosm of your life. I'm dead serious about that. You can interpret that just like a dream. It was absolutely a microcosm of his life. It was like, well, why can't I get anywhere? Well, there's these damned obstacles everywhere. It's like, look, there's a vacuum cleaner right in my door. How can I do anything when there's a vacuum cleaner in my door? It's like, well, you put it there. It's not like he didn't notice. He wasn't stupid. He noticed, he did it. And we had a discussion about that. It's like, well, why is your life so difficult? It's because you put obstacles in your path all the time. You just do nothing but, you could just walk there. No, you just put a vacuum cleaner in front and then you think, oh God, that's so much trouble. I'll just go and I don't know, what'll I do? Play a video game or I don't know. I won't go to where I'm going because of all these damned obstacles. So one of the things you might ask yourself, like he had to ask himself, is how many of the obstacles that get in your way, that make you bitter, that make you unable to act in the world, are obstacles that you put there? And God only knows is the answer to that. And maybe here's something else that's even a deeper question is, maybe you put those obstacles there on purpose, just so that you have a reason so that you can be useless. Which is exactly what he was doing, and he knew that. He came and told me that he did that. He was kind of laughing about it, although it wasn't that funny, because he did it. Actually, it was unbelievably, screamingly hilarious, to tell you the truth. It was so absurd. But there was a terrible, tragic element to it, too, because he basically just revealed to me and himself the whole essence of his life. It's like, so, back to the stool here. Okay, so, one of the things I could do to decrease the negative consequences of having that stool in front of me is just go like this. That'd be nice. I could just circumvent the obstacle entirely. So anyways, if I lay out this landscape so that there are clear pathways to my goals, then when I look at the landscape, I'm happy. And the reason I'm happy is because this is the definition of happy. So here's how it is that you're happy when you are. You have a goal. It's a good goal, and things are set up so that you can move towards it. And so then you think, well, that's very interesting because, well, first of all, it means you need a goal, which means you need a value structure. And second, it means that maybe there's a hierarchy of goals, right? Because some goals might be like the chicken's goal, just to get across the road, but maybe there are higher order goals. You might say, well, if you need a goal to orient yourself properly in the world, what's the best goal to aim at? Because if you're going to orient yourself in the world, and you're going to go to all the trouble of having a goal, then maybe you should have the best goal. Because why not? Why settle for something second rate? And then the next thing is, once you've established the goal that is good, then why not clean up the pathways to it so that you have the shining road in front of you so that you can walk towards your noble goal. And then maybe that'll add some positive meaning to your life. And there's no maybe about it. That is exactly how it works. And so one of the things you might ask yourself is, well, if there isn't any positive meaning in your life, maybe you're aiming at the wrong thing. And I tell you, man, you can think about that for about 15 years. Like every day for 8 hours, you can think, maybe I'm aiming at the wrong thing. Maybe my life isn't laying itself out the way it should because I'm aiming at the wrong thing. It's like, where's my error? What should I be aiming at? Well, these are very good questions. These are very good questions indeed. They are the ultimate questions, in fact. What should you be aiming at? There's a scene in Pinocchio, which is a movie I quite like. It's a work of genius, of course, an animated work of genius. It took people a long time to make that movie. They had to draw a lot of drawings, and they were very high-quality animators. And they had to sequence all those drawings, and they had to come to a collective decision about what they were going to draw, and they had to decide what the plot, every single bit of that movie, every single tiny bit, was the consequence of deep thought and collective decision-making, and done by a team of visionary geniuses. And so it's worth thinking about, you know, even though it's for kids, let's say. There's a great scene in there where Geppetto makes Pinocchio, wooden-headed puppet, marionette, so someone else is pulling his strings, right? Someone else is deciding what his values are going to be. That's the marionette. He's not an autonomous being. And Geppetto, who's a great craftsman and a positive father and someone who cares for his child, decides that it would be better if he was an autonomous and complete being. That's his wish. That's a good wish if you're a father. Well, what the hell else are you going to wish for? You want your son to remain a marionette? Is that the idea? So that you can pull his strings, or so that something else can? Or do you want the strings to disappear and have the thing that's not fully formed yet take its complete place in the world? And Geppetto's he's an archetype of the good father, as a craftsman, and as a craftsman who cares about children and makes toys and has a warm hearth and has a safe place to be, a place where kids can play. And he wants his child to expand completely into the world. And so what he does is, what does he do? He wishes upon a star. You think, well, you know, we do that. Maybe you do that with your kids. You tell them, well, you can wish on a star. You wish on a falling star. And everyone kind of knows what that means, but not really. You think, well, what does it mean to wish on a star? And you think, well, what's a star exactly? And I don't mean materialistically speaking. I know what a damn star is. You know, that's not the point. There's the star that's the material object, and there's the star that's the element of perception. And those aren't the same thing, even though they're overlaid upon one another. A star is a Hollywood star. Why is a Hollywood star a star? No one ever asks that, really. Well, a star is something that you look up to. A star is something to emulate. That's a Hollywood star. That's why people are starstruck. And it's because these people who are stars play these larger-than-life roles on the screen. And those are ritual models for emulation. So a star is something that you look up to so that you can emulate it. And Geppetto looks up to the stars, and that also means that he lifts his eyes above the mundane landscape. Right? He's not trying to get from this side of the stage to that side of the stage. He's thinking, what's the highest possible thing I could aim at? And the answer to that is the light that glistens in the darkness. I can lift my eyes up to that and I can orient myself towards that. The highest possible good. And that's the wish. And here's the upshot of that. If what you aim at determines how you perceive the world, then the highest possible aim that you can aim at lays out the best possible world that you can live in. And that's actually the truth. It's the hard, core, solid, scientific truth that that's the case. And so what happens with Geppetto is, because he's a good man and he's put in the thousands of hours of discipline necessary to be a careful, disciplined craftsman, and because he actually loves his son and wants the best for him, he looks up as high as he can possibly look and makes his wish. And his wish is, I wish that my son could be real, could be a real boy, not a wooden-headed puppet whose strings are being pulled by forces behind the scenes. And that's what that scene means. And it's absolutely brilliant. And it catalyzes a kind of development, right? Because what happens is Geppetto makes his wish, and then he falls asleep. And then the blue fairy shows up. That's Mother Nature, right? Mother Nature shows up and confers upon Geppetto's son a gift. And that's the gift of the beginning of autonomy. And what that means is that if you're a good father and you have a son, or you have a daughter for that matter, and you wish above all that they will become real, then nature will step in and give them a hand. And that's exactly how it works, right? And then the child himself or herself has to undertake their adventure in the world. They have to make their own moral decisions. You're not the owner of your child, even though you might be their guide. You might be the person who sets up the structure within which they can flourish or not. The child has to play his or her role, and that's also brilliantly detailed in the movie, to deal with temptations and to decide whether to tell the truth or to lie, and to decide whether to be neurotic and to be a victim, because of course that's part of the Pinocchio story. He's tempted by criminals into adopting the stance of victim. So that's something we could all meditate on for a certain amount of time. So you want to aim as high as you possibly can. And then the right things appear to you in the world as obstacles, and the right things appear to you in the world as pathways to move forward. And those pathways to move forward towards the highest goal fill your soul with the kind of contentment that allows you to withstand the suffering that characterizes being without becoming bitter. It's important. It keeps you away from hell. It helps you orient yourself towards the highest possible good. And then the world lays itself out in the proper manner. And you think, well, if I'm suffering, if things aren't good for me, if life is unbearable, then maybe I'm not aiming in the right place. And that's something that's endlessly worth thinking about. And I think that it's correct. So then you might think, well, having accepted that as a potential reality, how can you characterize what it is that you might aim at? And this, I think, is the answer, in some sense, to this postmodern conundrum that we've been faced with, which is partly a puzzle that's emerged as we've figured out that the world is a very difficult place to interpret. The world's very complicated. There are many, many ways to interpret it. How do you know which of those, how can you rank order those ways? The postmodern claim, and this is what's being taught in the universities, I would say, the postmodern claim is there's no way of rank ordering the multitude of ways that you can interpret the world. You can't make a final decision about route A or route B. It's a chaotic tumult of unconstrained possibility. And it's demolished, say, literary criticism, because for a long time people would try to understand what the book meant. But the postmodernists said, well, the book means an infinite number of things, and there's no way that you can rank order your interpretations because of that infinite complexity. And there's a manner in which that's true, because the world is very complicated. Any given text is complicated. How many ways can you interpret the Bible? An endless number of ways, because it's such a complicated text. It's tied into everything. It depends on where you look. It depends on how you look, because, of course, how things manifest themselves to you depends on how you look. And so it's a powerful critique, except for one thing. There is a very large number of ways of looking at the world, but there aren't a very large number of ways, of viable ways of looking at the world. That's a whole different story. You know that, because if you look at the edge of a cliff like it's a solid place to walk, and you act that out, then you end up a crumpled pile of bleeding bones at the bottom of the cliff. And that seems to be evidence that that particular interpretation of that particular phenomena wasn't in your best interests. And so there's a very limited number of ways of looking at the world that you might say are in your best interest. And so that takes that terrible complexity that the postmodernists have sort of put in front of us and organizes it. And you can think this through, and this is part of the way that you think through what it is that you should aim at. And this is the evolution of morality, as far as I'm concerned, and I think that's the right way to think about it. You can think about it metaphysically, or theologically, or biblically, or ethically, all those ways. But it's easier, in some sense, and it's easier and more in keeping with the full body of our knowledge to think about it as something that's emerged from the bottom up. It's like, here's the constraints. Why not just do what's impulsively pleasurable? I talk about that in Rule 7. Do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Expedient is momentary pleasure. Cocaine is expedient, right? Promiscuity is expedient. Gluttony is expedient. Violence can be expedient. Victory can be expedient. It's something that works now. And you might think, well, why not just do what works now? And the answer to that is, because you're not just here now. You're here now, and you're here now, and you're here now, and there you are, repeating away through time. right? So there's the you that's sitting here now, but there's the you that's going to wake up tomorrow, and there's the you that's going to wake up in a month and in a year, and God willing, 5 years and 10 years and 20 years. And so you can't just take care of who you are now, right this second, in the most expedient possible way, because the you that you're going to be has to put up with the consequences of the you that you are now. There's a funny scene in a Simpsons cartoon, so I think it's extraordinarily funny, where Homer is mixing up a quart of mayonnaise and vodka. And he downs the whole thing. And Marge says, well, that's you should think twice about doing that. And Homer says, well, that's a problem for future Homer. I'm sure glad I'm not that guy. So anyways, I think that's very funny. But that's exactly it. It's like, you know, you're all future Homers, man. And so a little bit of impulsive expediency goes a very long way. And so you have to think about your life as an iterating game, right? You have to play the game right now. But you have to play the game right now in a way that doesn't compromise the way you play it tomorrow, and that doesn't compromise the way you play it next week, and next month, and next year, and 5 years from now, and 10 years from now. And maybe the constraint is even more severe than that. Maybe you want to play the game right now so that the game you play tomorrow is slightly better, and the game you play 2 years from now is even better than that. So you don't want to just play a game that you can repeat you don't want to play a game that you can repeat at a plateau, and you don't want to play a game that you can repeat that deteriorates. That's definitely a bad game. Things are going from, you know, bad to worse. Who wants to play that? Well, maybe if you're a martyr, you could do that, and you'll meet people like that. But maybe you want to play a game that goes like this, when that's oriented towards whatever that star is. And so that's a tight constraint, man, and everybody knows that. That's the straight and narrow. That's a tough one. And then it's worse than that, because it isn't just you that's at stake here and the iterated future yous. You're also embedded in the world. It's like, well, there's you, but then there's the person you're with, your intimate partner, or maybe your father, or maybe your mother, your siblings, or your children. And they're just as much you as you, or maybe even more. You know, people will die for their children, so maybe they're more their children than they are themselves. Depends on how you look at it. And so you have to propagate yourself through time in a manner that ascends, but at the same time you have to do it in a manner that makes your children's life ascend, and maybe your parents' lives, and your siblings' lives, and then there's your friends. Same problem. And then there's the broader community. And so you actually have to organize all your aims and stack them all up so that whole system ascends at the same time. And there's not an infinite number of ways of doing that. There's a finite number of ways of doing that. And the finite way is the way that you do things when you do them right. And everyone knows that. And that seems to be aligned with something like telling the truth, which is Rule 8 in my book. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie.